So our next speaker is Pascal.
Okay.
Pascal is based in Amsterdam, originally coming from the border region of Cologne. He's the head of engineering of Evercure. He did plenty of AI and data projects in his past for McKinsey and Quantum Black. And he was also a data engineer for Dataminded several years ago. So a big welcome to Pascal for the next talk.
Thank you. Can you hear me with this one? Because I have a microphone on me, but I don't know if it actually, or do I need to use both? I need to use both. Okay. All right. I thought you gave me this one because I like to gesture a lot like an Italian, and so I get my hands free, but no. Yeah, cool. So every AI slide these days needs to have some Gen AI generated picture, right? I want to talk to you about knowledge graphs, and particularly how they're used in drug repurposing. Drug repurposing is related to drug discovery, but instead of trying to come up with a new chemical compound, it's the attempt to figure out which compound can you use for a disease where the compound already exists, or ideally it's already approved by the FDA or the European institutions or the Japanese or whichever regulator you are falling under. So in a way, it's easier because you massively reduce the search space and you already know that that compound is safe. But it's also a lot harder because it is not starting from a clean slate. You can't just design the perfect compound, but you need to figure out if that compound that already exists can be used for a specific target in your body. Before I move on, I'm actually curious, who here knows what a knowledge graph is or has thought about it, worked with it? Okay. Who's played around with GraphRag, the latest and greatest in Gen AI? Okay. It's cool. So, well, who am I? I grew up in Cologne, and then I moved around a little bit, ended up with Dataminded for a couple of years in Belgium, and now I'm in Amsterdam. I'm a little bit of a vagabond. I don't really know where to go, but so far it's served me well, and Europe is a nice place to move around, so it's all good. And I spent, I don't know, 8 years as a software engineer, and then a couple of years as a data engineer with Dataminded, and then also with McKinsey, as mentioned earlier. And then I realized that this constant hopping around from project to project, it gets kind of tiring after a while. So I really wanted to dedicate my life for a couple of years to something that's really worth solving. And so I stumbled across Evercure, which essentially is trying to find, of all the drugs and all the diseases, if you map them all on top of each other, there's like 50 million combinations, depending on how you count drugs and diseases. It's actually a highly debated space because what constitutes a drug and what constitutes a disease, not as easy as one would think. But it's around 50 million pairs, and they want to look at each pair and see, okay, what's the probability that this drug can help this disease? And so that's essentially drug repurposing, but at scale, because instead of what most pharma companies do, which is they try to just figure out, okay, can we use my specific compound for something else? Evercure, we're trying to figure out, can we use any of these existing compounds for any of the diseases? And the way that I want to structure this talk is along two kind of S-curves. And I believe that we're now somewhere at the beginning of a new S-curve. Everything, of course, comes back to foundation models and large language models and Gen AI. But there is something fundamental that I'll show how these two technologies can come together. I kind of structured it along 4 acts. The first one is the traditional way of building knowledge graphs, and how they can be, or how the initial wave kind of started. Then need for a paradigm shift. There's a lot of problems that arise when you actually try to distill all of medical and biological knowledge of the world into a graph. It sounds kind of easy in theory, but it's actually kind of nitpicky and a lot of work. And then how foundation models are kind of stealing the show, and maybe let's discuss about where that goes. Particularly for the last one, I hope we can have a fun debate, because it's all, predicting the future, so everybody can have an opinion, anything goes. But let's talk about the first one. So this is a bit of a history of where we came from. And it's actually kind of interesting. The way that we found a lot of pharmaceutical compounds was mostly by luck, just kind of stumbling across compounds and realizing, oh yeah, okay, that's actually, makes your headache go away, so that's nice. So there's this Australian musician who has a song about the bark of a willow tree. I was like, aspirin. So people just kind of distilled natural compounds into substances that we're all quite familiar with now. And at some point, that luck runs out. On a global scale, we ended up plucking all the low-hanging fruit. And so pharmaceutical companies had to become a lot more structured and really apply active research and align and coordinate each other to find the next compound. And so when this, as the pharmaceutical companies did this, there's the realization that, well, there's a lot of data there. So data analytics started to come about, and maybe we can dig into all of the data that we get from our different silos. But the problem is that there are a lot of silos in pharma companies. And there's anyone who's ever worked at a biotech, I'm pretty sure you've heard of LIMS data. It's a beast to integrate into your data lake. It's always good fun when a data engineer who grew up in the cloud goes to a pharma company, goes, oh, let me just connect to your lab data and ingest it all. Yeah. Is your cloud GXP regulated? Because if it's not, then you are not going to touch my lab equipment. And so there's all of this data sitting, talking different languages, having different concepts, using different identifiers, and bringing all of that together is kind of where knowledge graphs made the claim that, well, we can kind of throw everything almost in a graph, because a graph is the most generic thing you could think of. It's just you have entities and they have relationships, and then you can just chuck basically anything under the sun in there. And you can map these different graphs that are disconnected. You can map them on top of each other, so you can have different domains start interconnecting and then see how that information actually works together. So you can bring together proteomics and genomics and electronic health records and your post-market surveillance, and you can start introducing those connections. And so there were some initial knowledge graphs, and I wanted to actually show them on the browser, but I'm a bit scared because I was told that that's not as easy. I was going to present on my own laptop. But there's a QR code at the end of the presentation, so all of this is linked, and the nice thing is all of this is open public research, so you can literally connect to those databases and play around with Cypher queries and connect to Neo4j. So there were some initial knowledge graphs from the research institutions that were published. A couple of early examples are HatioNet, which just started connecting a number of different databases and bringing them together, starting to map identities and identifiers to each other and making sure that they all use the same identity scheme. Then OpenBioLink and RTX, which are all kind of trailblazers initially. And so the way that you can often visualize a knowledge graph, because if you try to say, let me just look at the big picture, can I zoom out, put all of the nodes and just look at them? Turns out it's extremely hard, because if you're trying to visualize 25 million nodes and 120 million edges or so, there's no algorithms that are not NP complex that are able to draw such a knowledge graph in an optimal way, or a graph in general. It's very hard to draw graphs. It's a fun little academic side quest. And so you can use these metagraphs, which are essentially, if you classify all of your nodes into different types, you have drugs, diseases, you have proteins, etc., and then you plot the metagraph of what categories are connected and how are these categories interconnected, you get something like this, where diseases might cause other diseases, or a cell has a certain disease, or a compound treats a disease, and gene up and down regulates all sorts of things. And so this gives you a little bit of the schema. This is like the knowledge graph version of a SQL schema. And so then all sorts of, once you have your kind of generic knowledge graphs, and the academics wanted to keep pushing onwards, specialized knowledge graphs started to arise. So there's different camps in the research space. There's the people that claim that you should really lump things together. So there's a saying, one of our colleagues, are you a lumper or a splitter? And so some people might say, really, you should lump genes and proteins together because a gene codes for a protein. And so from a drug repurposing standpoint, it makes it easier for the algorithms if they are not separate entities. But then others might say, well, technically it's not a one-to-one mapping because you have genes that translate into multiple proteins. So how do you deal with that? And so there's different philosophies about how do you construct your knowledge graph. Spoke, for example, follows a very strong curation approach. So the idea there is that you want to make sure that every edge really can be trusted and that you don't have bad data, wrong data in there. Because a lot of these knowledge graphs use NLP to come up with these triplets. So what they do is they use fairly established language processing to look at sentences and research papers and see, well, this protein, some words, downregulates, or this gene downregulates the expression of a certain protein. But those NLP techniques are kind of easy to also make mistakes. So one connection that I personally find very upsetting is that in some of these knowledge graphs, Epstein-Barr virus is classified as a drug and is connected to multiple sclerosis as treats multiple sclerosis, which is completely wrong. It has shown to be a required prerequisite for the arisal of multiple sclerosis, but it is certainly not a drug.
Have you guys not sort of come to the conclusion that these sorts of imperfections might result in like a bit of a conflict of interest, given that's in the medical sector, you've got a duty of care for patients, and this might risk or jeopardize the patients that are under care that are concerning these particular cases.
Sorry, I didn't quite get the question.
So, because like these LLMs aren't perfect, like there are still code mistakes, there might be an issue of the models themselves being liable for any sort of errors that might happen if there's a patient's life at risk.
Oh yeah, absolutely, yeah. Just to be, we're still not in the LLM land, right? This is all just traditional NLP. It's triplet extractions. It's entity and then relation extraction. I'll get to the LLMs later, and yeah. But yeah, there's a lot of work going into different directions. There's, for example, Prime, which is from Harvard. They just got a Nature publication a couple of days ago, where they are leveraging Prime together with graph neural networks to do drug prediction, repurposing prediction. And what they're doing is, instead of trying to give everything an ID and map everything to each other with some rule-based system, they use embedding models to add a vector to each node. And then they say, if two vectors are very close to each other, given a certain cutoff, we assume it's actually the same thing. So you trust in that moment that the model that creates the embeddings has a good understanding of what semantically two things are and whether they're the same or they are not. But it does become quite generic in that moment because, as I'll show you in like Act 2, there's a whole bunch of work that's happening on making these knowledge graphs follow certain structures. And it's painstaking work. And these embedding models are super generic because it's really just a distance measure. And then you group them together and you just kind of accept that that's now a new entity. But so Act 2 is we're kind of hitting a plateau. So initial low-hanging fruit, right? So we got some new low-hanging fruits through knowledge graphs, but we're now hitting a plateau again where it's quite tedious to create these knowledge graphs. And so problem one, everyone copies from the same sources. If you want to get a good amount of genetic information, then ultimately there's not that many global resources that collect and categorize and structure and make it openly accessible to pull in all that genome data. And the same for proteins and all sorts of, diseases, what are actually the ICD codes, what are RX norm codes. So everyone kind of copies from the same places. But here's the thing, if you look at the actual code, just because you're connected and sucking in the data doesn't mean that you're consuming it the same way, and it doesn't mean that two different knowledge graphs actually turn that input into the same output. So just because they're all connected to the same, you could make an initial analysis and go 80-20 and say, well, you know what, DRKG and maybe oregano, they have a pretty low overlap, so we're going to combine oregano and DRKG, and then we've got a good coverage of most of the data sources. But then they might only take one or two properties, and they're missing trustworthiness of an edge. So what's often the case is that some of these sources might give you a certain sense of how trustworthy is this information, but then some of these KGs might not carry that information through. And it is very important that you know how trustworthy an edge is. Otherwise, it's associated with, A is associated with B. Well, is it like a little bit associated with it, or does it really 99% correlate? And so there's a big challenge with this, where everyone copies from the same places, but then they all create new knowledge graphs. And so, well, why don't we just agree on standards? And so one of our colleagues from, I think he's from Renzi, I'm not 100% sure, but he gives a really cool talk, and you can also find this on YouTube, where he kind of outlines the problem of agreeing on standards. And this is actually, this amused me quite a bit, because when he gave this talk, I had to think of a very, very large bank that I worked with at McKinsey that has the same problem, but for them it's who's actually our customer, and like, can we agree on the same identifier for our customer? And there's some banks that are so large that they don't even have the same identifier for an employee, let alone a customer. And the same problem is basically exists in almost every domain, where you really you're in your little bubble, and you realize, okay, we need to give things IDs, and so you come up with an identifying scheme, and then you're kind of settled, it kind of works, and then suddenly you have to collaborate with another institution. So, damn, but they use a different schema. Okay, so can we convince them? Can we somehow force their hand and make them use our thing? And then that doesn't work. So then you have semantic entity mapping, where you map different identifier schemes to each other. But so there's a lot of work happening here, and I really respect the work that these people do. But the question that I kind of had is, as a patient, is this ontology going to save my life, or is it? What does a cell in my body care about an ontology? It's quite far away. It's very academic, and so the question then is, can this? Well, I think this doesn't work now because it's a PDF. Essentially, a video of showing how a polymerase goes through your RNA strand and generates new proteins. But KGs really struggle with encoding this continuous data, and the human body is extremely complex. You have, well, I don't actually know the number, but very, very many billions and billions of proteins and genes and molecules all interacting in every single cell across the whole body. And so an emergent property of that is continuous probabilities of things happening. You have a concentration of a drug in your body. You're not on aspirin, or you're not on aspirin. You are in some parts of your cells, you have a higher concentration, and in some you have a lower concentration, and there's a certain probability that the compound binds to a target at any given point in time. And so these knowledge graphs, they are great for a human to understand and read it and go, okay, this affects this, which downregulates that, which upregulates this, which is kind of related to that. But it's a very crude estimate. It's like saying Germans are more punctual than Italians. That's a very crude estimate, but how much does it help you actually navigate the real world? Not that much. And it might be kind of correct, but yeah, okay. That's still much more coarse than how the real world actually is. And so now the third act, which is ChatGPT. All problems solved. Clearly not. Like, big disclaimer, no, don't use ChatGPT as your doctor's advice, clearly. But there is something about language models where this is, can I zoom in a little bit? Ah, look at that. If you think about the value chain of building such a knowledge graph, it's something along the lines of you suck in a bunch of data, and then you integrate it all together, and you define certain ground truths, so that might be the diseases or the drugs you're going after, and you're filtering for some kind of quality. Then you might enrich that data with additional pieces of information that aren't necessarily graph information, but in many cases, many researchers, it might be embedding models. And then you have your unified knowledge graph. And then you just let a horde of data scientists go run tons of experiments, come up with cool models. They try and compete each other. Ideally, you have some form of a unified evaluation suite where you evaluate the performance of the models off of some objective metrics, whatever that might mean, so that the best data scientist may win. And then ultimately, you might release a model or you write a research paper. And so you can tag LLMs everywhere. You can maybe use LLMs to integrate knowledge, these data sources. So this whole thing of, are these two entities actually the same? They're actually doing a pretty good job. If you ask a language model, are these two things the same thing? You know, it gets it 80-20 right, and it's better to have 80% correction than to not have 80% correction. Or they're quite good at quality filters as well. Is Epstein-Barr virus a drug? Probably not. LLMs get that pretty well. The language model embeddings here, they're particularly useful. You add to each node in your knowledge graph a vector embedding, and then you can train models very easily on this because these are numbers. So you can train XGBoost, random forest, language models, neural networks. You can train basically any model on these numbers rather than on the graph. And then here at the end, you might also use the language models to take a drug disease pair and then evaluate, make a case for it and make a case against it, and you kind of let them debate each other, and then you see, okay, can you make, or can a language model make a case for a drug disease pair? You can then start leveraging RAG, so you can give these language models access to the internet. They can start searching PubMed and all sorts of ArcSiv and all the research papers, and they can try and see, is there already existing evidence? So then you can cut down from the 50 million to maybe 100,000 potential pairs. But then the question is, if you put these models all over the place, you still have a lot of, well, hold on. Hello. Ah. Somehow okay, I can't click. Okay, yeah. Yeah, so you can use these language models in a number of different places, right? So like I mentioned earlier, PrimeKG uses BERT cosine similarity to merge nodes. You can do the drug disease pairing. And you can also generate completely new knowledge graphs because you can use a lot more sophisticated NLP now to actually extract these triplets. But then the question is, maybe can you just replace this entire complex beast? Ultimately, a knowledge graph is just a representation of information in a way that you're trying to give, given a certain input, an output prediction. And what language models have shown us is that they are fairly good at compressing and representing information in latent space. You shouldn't ask ChatGPT to do math, but it's pretty cool that in 10, 20, 30 gigabytes of raw data, it can compress basically everything you could possibly ask Wikipedia. So there's a huge information compression that's happening there. And so does it really make sense to take all of our entire published academic literature, extract triplets out of them, force them into these ontologies, do all of the ontology mapping and all of these kind of bending exercises, just to then come out with a prediction, when in fact what transformer models really do is, given a certain input, predict the next most likely output. So if you were to use a transformer model and you say, given the patient history here and all of this information, the most likely next helpful drug is, and then let the model predict it. This is called, I think, patient journey modeling. So you try to predict the most likely next event to happen in the patient journey. But this could just as well be applied for what is the most likely next drug that would help. And yes, again, big disclaimer, these are just models. This is definitely not something that people should start taking as medical advice. But there is something to be said about engineers tend to over-engineer. And sometimes it's very nice when you can just delete, we have like 120,000 lines of code right now, with some really nice and clean foundation model, maybe a couple hundred lines of PyTorch code, and just train a model. Independent of all of that, there are some problems that remain. The number one is, if you do want to encode everything into a knowledge graph, knowledge graphs aren't actually as scalable as something like Spark or Ray. There's some other big data technologies that are much better at scaling. You can't actually easily load a very large knowledge graph into a decent database and do queries at scale, because yes, there are some distributed graph databases, but it's definitely not as mature. Data bias remains the same, right? So depending on the data source that you pull in, you're going to get a strong bias. If you turn this into a giant foundational model, then the black box problem becomes ever more hard. It's already quite fun. Well, we can play this game later, actually. I'll try and explain how our knowledge graph works, and then we see if a doctor goes like, oh yeah, that's easy to understand. But with those with these foundation models, it's even worse, because they're just a black box. In goes something, out comes a prediction. But the biggest problem of all in this drug discovery and repurposing space is that it's very hard to actually put a label on how good is your prediction, because you don't have real world feedback. Normally, when you have a model, it predicts you something, and then you can try and see how good that works. So if you had a model, for example, that would propose for people who are in a new city, the model would predict them a person to meet, to make friends. You get fairly fast feedback, because they meet the person and then they say, I like them or I didn't like them. It's low risk. They might get a coffee and not like each other, and you get feedback after 2 or 3 days. So a model like that you could train fairly easily. Click rate, the reason why we have all of the online advertising is because you get instant feedback to your model. You show the user something, a couple 100,000 people click an ad, you get good feedback, you can train your model. Making a prediction that this drug helps this disease takes a couple of years, and then you might learn after a couple of years for maybe 10 drug disease pairs, because it's very hard to go after 10,000. You might get 10. They're all wrong. Okay, so you just spent 5 years to figure out that the top 10 were wrong, and so now what do you do? So this is actually, I think, the hardest problem of them all, to somehow get a good proxy of this drug disease pair actually works, because maybe you can simulate ligand protein interaction based on in silico models, or maybe you can run cell lines in a lab. You need some form of proxy to get sufficient conviction that this pair will actually work in the body, in the patient, in the clinical setting. So to wrap it up, KGs broke the silos, so that's kind of nice. You can integrate your clinical data with your R&D data, with your real-world evidence, your post-market surveillance. All of that information can be integrated. That's fantastic. There is a limit on how much they can help. They're thinking in identifiers, which is ultimately, the knowledge graphs are kind of the brainchild of mathematicians and database administrators, but our bodies don't really care much about database schemas. So that also poses some limitations. Foundation models are showing some interesting promise. Definitely the research space is very hot in this right now. But unless we somehow solve this problem of how do we verify without going all the way to the patient and running a full-on clinical trial that this prediction is good, it still remains a very strong hit or miss space. Thank you. Oh yeah, this is the QR code. If you scan this, you get to the website that this presentation is, and then you can click through it and all the links you can click on. You had a question? I think he's scanning. Yeah.
I have a question. What happens if you combine the two techniques, right? So for example, I know somebody that's working on a combination of knowledge graphs and foundation models.
Well, the question, how do you combine it? Do you combine it at the creation state, at the refinement state, at the quality checks, at the model prediction, or at the prediction evaluation?
He's basically, so my body is building a tool that does it from the start. It actually uses a foundation model to begin the creation of the knowledge graph.
Yeah. A direction that I think we and many others are going after. It gets really expensive if you do it at scale.
But drug trials are even more expensive like that.
Yeah. But there's, I think, 5 million papers on PubMed, or maybe 30. I forget. But it's in the millions. And let's say you take all of the papers, and first, parsing PDFs is already a problem in itself. But let's say you solve PDFs. Actually, Gina AI here in Berlin, they have a pretty cool API, so I can recommend them. You somehow turn that into Markdown, and then you chunk it up properly, and you extract all the triplets. And you somehow get from the triplets also the probability or the weight on them, which is, again, very hard. And then you build a knowledge graph. How do you build it? Do you build a lexicographical graph, or do you build a knowledge graph? If you build a knowledge graph, which ontology do you follow? Which structure do you use?
Yeah. Not easily solved that way.
Probably you can get some uplift. I'm pretty sure you'll get some uplift. And yes, we're looking into using existing knowledge graphs and augmenting them with additional language model-based information. So maybe mapping a lexicographical graph under a knowledge graph so that you can connect all the chunks of the research papers into the knowledge graph, which is really great afterwards if you look at a pair and then you say, okay, show me the scientific evidence, because it's one connection away, which is this edge is justified through this academic research paper, and so you can immediately create a user interface where you can show the people the academic pieces. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, I have two questions. And the first one is about the definition of KT. I'm still not very sure about. Can I say it's just a representation of association, and it could be either causal or like predictive. Is that right? Or unclear association?
I'm scared to misrepresent the probably much better definition of Wikipedia, or yeah, so in my mind, a knowledge graph is a representation of a large amount of knowledge following some form of I don't want to say ontology, but a way of structuring your information. You follow certain rules. And it's often a subject, predicate, object pattern. So something upregulates, downregulates, blocks, hinders, triggers something else. And then you can have all sorts of subject aspect qualifiers and object aspect qualifiers, and you can have context regulators. So you can have as much fun as you want modeling that piece of information, but it's ultimately just taking a mathematical graph and then having entities and relationships structured in a way that somehow helps your domain.
So it's kind of association.
It's always associations, yeah. It's always about relationships.
Okay. The second question is about, can you maybe share with us any specific examples of any successful drug repurposing that was facilitated by knowledge graphs? Germany or either in Germany or outside?
I'm not aware of any with knowledge graphs specifically. I actually had a good amount of fun with the advanced voice model of ChatGPT, because you know these models are always trying to please you. So I asked it, what has actually happened? It's like, yeah, there's lots of academic research and big successes, but which drug disease actually was found? And I'm not aware of any through knowledge graphs. There are plenty of repurposing cases. The obvious one is Wegovy for weight loss at the moment. There's another one that used to treat blood pressure and is now used for issues in the bedroom. There is a bit of a story of why every cure has such a compelling story is because our founder, he almost died of Castleman's disease, and then he found a drug that helped him. But that had nothing to do with knowledge graph. It was just brute force search and grit and finding something that helped his specific version of Castleman's. But it would be nice to have one initial breakthrough so that the methodology proves itself.
Is it supervised learning? You categorize this kind of rule as supervised learning, yeah?
Yeah, so you have all the existing indications as training data.
Actually, because from my experience, medicine, biology, when you work with biologists, we always have this problem that they don't trust the other expert. They don't trust other annotator. I actually trust one annotator, one biologist, and prepared the trained AI model for her.
Mm-hmm.
But the other one came to me and said, it's an immune disease. She's wrong. She just said it's not. How we can overcome this kind of the problems? Because in medicine, we have lots of problems like this.
Yeah. I don't know. It's a very, it's a very noisy data, right? Scientific publications also are fraught with people really wanting to publish something, and then it's a noisy space. But in general, models are capable of learning even in a noisy environment. But then you're not going to get a 99% correct answer. You're going to get
The problem is the expert cannot trust each other.
Yeah.
This is the problem. 3 biologists have 3 different ideas.
Yeah, ask a data engineer about their favorite data or compute orchestration tool. Then there's.
Because as a supervised learning system, I need these labels. So we have a different label for same data. How we can.
There's some. Sorry, are you?
Just one more question.
Okay. Yeah.
My question is, have you done perhaps some additional complexity that could be added into the knowledge graph in regards on like the diseases? Because if the aim is probably to care for the disease, I would perhaps hope to also connect the typical causes that usually the medical industry looks for. Either they are environmental causes or genetic causes or something like that. And if you correlate not only the current pharmaceuticals that cure diseases, but also environmental factors, genetic factors, and so on, perhaps there would be a higher chance of success on finding those correlations and enable a proper trial. Is that already involved?
I'm happy to report that one of the knowledge graphs has marital status as one of the nodes. Yes, I'm 100% with you. The environmental factors are huge, and I think there's maybe not biologists, but there's all sorts of schools of thought that argue, what's the cause of cancer? What's the cause of metabolic disease? Should you take diabetes? Should you take insulin, or should you? So all of these environmental factors can definitely be added to the knowledge graph. The data source is going to be an interesting one. What's the data source where you get environmental factors at scale? Real-world evidence and electronic health records are a component that you can add. But then the moment you start asking people for just contributing, their personal environmental factors, then you have the human, and the human has a desire, and so they might introduce certain biases as well. So then you have the problem again of, if you don't have high quality going in, it's I don't know what is the answer, whether it's good to have a 500 million node KG with all sorts of information, or if the right answer is to have a very, very small but highly selected knowledge graph where we know everything is true.